Welcome to episode 3 of CloudBees 101. In this episode, we will be talking about persona. Well, what is a persona and how do we even spell it? A persona is essentially a type of profile that we find in a company, in an organization. And you might be wondering, well, does it really matter? Well, actually, persona are very important, and too frequently we ignore them or don't even know that they exist, but they're really, really core to anything we do in a company. It can be in product, in marketing, or in sales. They are a very important concept. So first, when we talk about the market, we talk about companies and whether we can sell something to that company. Well, so let's start there. Let's talk about companies first. You'll find a lot of different companies. Typically, we see them split in three buckets. First one, SMB, for small, medium businesses, is for the small part below 50% and below 10 million in revenue. Medium, typically below 100% and below 50 million in revenue. Then comes the mid-market, below 500 to 1,000 employees and generally up to $1 billion in revenue. And above that, you have enterprises. And logically, they have above 1,000 employees and above $1 billion in revenue. And sometimes you will hear groups such as Fortune 500. Those are the 500 largest US public companies. Public meaning publicly traded. You can buy stock online of those companies. Or Global 2000, those are the 2000 largest public companies, but not in the US, in the world. So at CloudBees, we focus on enterprises and some of the biggest companies in the mid-market, but increasingly we're actually able to go down and solve problems for smaller organizations. And so those companies are very different in what they need and how they behave. For example, take a public company. That's, again, a company where you can trade their stock on public markets, like the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ. Those companies have tons of compliance issues they need to solve. Well, a small company don't have that much compliance to solve, so they will not be looking for the same solution. And sometimes we also hear that small companies have more time than they have money, while larger organizations to have more money than they have time. It's kind of a joke, but quite frankly, it has some truth to it. And so it will also influence what type of solution they are looking for. Anyway, every company will behave in a different way and will have different needs based on their side. So let's open the box to understand how they operate. And the first thing you will realize when you do this is that it is absolutely not homogeneous. It's a bit like a village, right? You have a lot of different people, each with a different expertise, each are going to have different objectives that are tightly linked to their job. And that seems simple at first, but really it's not. For example, take any company. If you were to ask a CEO for their objectives, they'd probably tell you that they want to grow in a healthy way, that is, by making money. Easy enough. But if you go in that company and talk to, say, a compliance officer, that compliance officer will not care about any of this at all, probably. Their objective is going to be all about keeping the company compliance with various regulations. And so it's not related to growing revenue or having a good margin. And so at CloudBees, when we are selling our solutions, we're typically talking to IT, information technology. The big boss here is typically called a CIO, for Chief Information Officer. And if yourself, you're not in IT, well, I'm sure that IT really feels like a simple, single, homogeneous thing. Once again, it's essentially where the people working with computer, software, and internet cables live. It's one big thing. Yeah, well, let's open that box. And if you do so, you will find a lot of different persona with lots of different responsibilities and objectives. Same story all over again. Well, why does it matter? Why should I care? Well, let's say you want to sell CloudBees software. Who are you going to be talking to? You would not talk to an accountant, right? That seems pretty obvious. Well, yeah, so just talk to IT. Yeah, but there is no such thing as talking to IT. Because once you open the box, the IT box, you will find a lot of different roles. You'll have developers, engineering managers, security teams, compliance teams, operation teams. So who should I be talking to? It's complicated. Well, let's go through a few of those persona. But first, a little disclaimer. Every company is really different. They sometimes even use the same names for different things. And they're typically also constantly evolving. So don't look at what I'm going to say here as strict definitions of how things are in every company. The most important thing here is to focus on the high-level concepts, grow an intuitive understanding of those things, the big categories. That's what really matters. The first big split you have to understand is a split between application development teams and IT ops. Application development, who sometimes live under a CTO or directly under the CIO, is where the products are built internally. So that's where you will find the developers and the coders. They get requirements from the business and they want to go fast to differentiate the company by producing innovative and cool new applications. They're always looking for the new thing to help them differentiate. They always want to go faster. On the other side of the house, you'll find IT ops. I kind of see them as the adult in the room, to be candid with you, because they're the one wearing the pagers, taking responsibility for systems to never go down. They're the one waking up at 4 a.m. when things go wrong with the systems. And they'll be called night or day if something goes wrong. So they want to make sure things are solid. So to do that, they're going to put processes, checks, constraints in place so things do not go sideways. Obviously, as you can imagine, there is a tension between those two groups, right? Because one team wants to go fast and the other wants to go safe. So you need to find the right mix, the right chemistry between those two groups. If you were to only have one team or the other, nothing would happen. So you really need the right mix. And by the way, we will cover that in the future episode, but the very notion of DevOps comes from that tension, right? Dev is for development, application development, and ops for IT ops. So DevOps is all about making this relationship much smoother and efficient. You have then a lot of other teams next to app dev and IT ops. For example, security is very important as well, and increasingly so. You've probably seen news all over the place about companies getting hacked, credit card numbers sold on the internet, and so on and so on. This is the responsibility of the cybersecurity team to make sure it does not happen. They need to make sure that the work of IT ops and app dev and a lot more teams is secure. They have to be able to identify each and every IT asset we consume, identify if there are any vulnerabilities in those assets, and if there are, then make sure that those get fixed promptly. It's essentially your fire brigade, right? And there are many, many more teams. But what we've seen here is really the simple form of IT in a company. Because you see, as organizations grow, it's not rare to have another layer of sophistication that adds on top. Imagine a much larger enterprise. What they typically end up having are business units. They're like small companies within the company. And they're sufficiently different that they like to operate in a relatively independent fashion. So a lot of them end up having their own IT teams, so they can operate at their own pace. So they end up with their own developers. They might even have their own IT ops. And that's where the notion of shared services comes into the picture. Shared services is essentially a way to avoid replicating each and every service across each and every business unit, because it's not efficient to replicate everything. So you end up with one central team called shared services, or when it comes to some of the CloudBees business, we also call that shared DevOps. And They will host and maintain a number of core services that everybody across all business units can use. And I said can use, because again, in some organization, business units are going to be forced to use those shared services, while in other companies, it depends. They can do whatever they feel like. If they like a service provided by shared services, they think it's good and useful, they can use it. And if they don't like it or think it's too costly or not well managed, they have the freedom to duplicate that service or that behavior in their own world. So as you can see, every company is different. And why does it matter again? Well, when interacting with a company, it is very important to understand how they are structured. It is really their DNA. If you don't have this information, you might as well ask an accountant whether they want to buy CloudBees CI, or ask a developer to pick the accounting software we should be using. There is zero chance this is going to work. The best chance you have to win is to go with the most specific persona and the most specific pain point that person has and come up with a solution. Go to the wrong persona and you're an annoyance. Go too high in the org chart and you're a detail they don't care about. Go too low and they either cannot make sense of what you're offering or cannot afford it. So you need to aim right. So we have to map those out. And so the very first thing you do when you go in a company is to understand how they are structured, how they operate, and what specific pain points they have. That information can then be used in lots of different ways. For example, take the product organization. The product organization is using this information to define who they should be interviewing to build, say, the user interface. For example, in lots of organizations, the buyer of some software is frequently not the user of that software, right? Buyer versus user. So yeah, when you're in sales, you need to convince the buyer, but that buyer is never going to use your software. So it would be silly to build the user interface for that buyer. You actually need to interview the users of that software. The same is true in marketing. When you create campaigns, when you reach out to people, well, you want to make sure that you define very clearly who is that person. And we call that an ICP, an ideal customer profile. And you need to define what message is likely going to resonate the most with that ICP and what call to action you're expecting from that ICP. Is it to download some software, to read a document, to try your software? Again, this requires a very fine understanding of the different personas that you have in a company and what is likely going to trigger a reaction from them. The same is true in sales as well. How do you get sales done? Well, in sales, it's even a lot more complicated because you do not need to convince a single persona, but in most cases, you actually have to convince different persona that your software is useful. So it is very frequent in companies that they use a sales methodology to define precisely what is expected from the sales team. You might have heard of methodologies like MEDDIC. As you can see, a few of those letters here are actually about making sure you're talking to the right persona that you need to convince. I know it's kind of a boring topic to talk about persona, and it feels very abstract at first. But I can tell you, it's a very, very important one. I know that personally, initially, persona felt so abstract that I didn't quite understand why they matter so much. It's really once you start operating things at scale and teach other people how to do things that you realize that those are very critical to getting the job done. So to grow a better understanding of persona, here is a small exercise you can do. Sit back and think about yourself in your job at CloudBees and think about what you care about and what product or services you would be interested in as part of your job. What pain points do you have that you would love to see fixed? Is there anything that every day you feel like it's too complicated and there should be a better way? Now, if a salesperson was to reach out to you and talk about that pain point, would it resonate with you? What words should that person use to get your attention versus what should they not say, otherwise they would lose their credibility immediately. Could you pay for it in your position, or would you need somebody else to open their budget? Would you care enough about that pain point to get things moving along? For example, would you introduce your boss to that salesperson so that this pain point can be solved, or not? And if you're not willing to do that, is it because you don't think the pain is high enough? Or is it because you think the solution might not be good enough? Or maybe you think that it's not your place to solve such a problem. If not, who is going to solve it? So going through that little exercise can show you why persona matter and why you should be able to do that. Like for everything, things feel very simple at first, but as you drill into them, you understand that a company is a big village full of people, each with a different job, with different objectives, different problems, with their own budget, with their own constraints. So if you want to be successful, you'll need to find the right person to talk to in that village. So good luck.